Next, I said compare the effect of education and the lack of it on our nature to experience like this. Human beings living in an underground cave like dwelling with an entrance a long way up, which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. They've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place with their necks and legs fettered, able only to see in front of them because their bonds prevent them from turning their heads around. Light is provided by a fire burning from far above and behind them. Also behind them, but on higher ground, there is a patch stretching between them and the fire. Imagine that along this path a low wall has been built, like the screen in front of puppeteers above which they show their puppets. I'm imagining it. Then also that there are people along the wall carrying all kinds of artifacts that project above it, statues of people and other animals made out of stone, wood, and every material. And, as you'd expect, some of the carriers are talking and some are silent. It's a strange image you're describing, and strange prisoners. They're like us, do you suppose, first of all, that these prisoners see anything of themselves and one another besides the shadows of the fire cast on the wall in front of them? How could they if they have to keep their heads motionless throughout life? What about the thing being carried along the wall? Isn't the same true of them? Of course. And if they could talk to one another, don't you think they'd suppose that the names they used apply to the things they see passing before them? They'd have to. And what if the prison also had an echo from the wall facing them? Don't you think they believed that the shadows passing in front of them were talking wherever one of the carriers passing along the wall was doing so? I certainly do. Then the prisoners would in every way believe that the truth is nothing other than the shadows of those artifacts. They must surely believe that. Consider then what being released from their bonds and cured of their ignorance would naturally be like if something like this came to pass. When one of them was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his head, walk, and look up toward the light, he'd be pained and dazzled and unable to see the things whose shadows he had seen before. What do you think he'd say if we told him that what he'd seen before was inconsequential, but that now, because he's a bit closer to the things that are and is turned towards the things that are more, he sees more correctly? Or to put it another way, if we pointed to each of the things passing by, asked him what each of them is, and compelled him to answer, don't you think he'd be at a loss and that he'd believe that the things he saw earlier were truer than the ones he saw now being shown? Much truer. And if someone compelled him to look at the light itself, wouldn't his eyes hurt, and wouldn't he turn around and flee towards the things he's able to see, believing that they're really clearer than the ones he's being shown? He would. And if someone dragged him away from there by force up the rough, steep path and didn't let him go until he had dragged him into the sunlight, wouldn't he be pained and irritated at being treated that way? And when he came into the light, with the sun filling his eyes, wouldn't he be unable to see a single one of those things now said to be true? He would be unable to see them, at least at first. I suppose then that he'd need time to get adjusted before he could see things in the world above. At first he'd see shadows most easily, then images of men and other things in water, then the things themselves. Of these, he'd be able to study the things in the sky and the sky itself more easily at night, looking at the light of the stars and the moon than during the day, looking at the sun and the light of the sun. Of course, finally, I suppose, he'd be able to see the sun, not images of it in water or some alien place, but the sun itself in its own place, and be able to study it. Necessarily so. And at this point, he would infer and conclude that the sun provides the seasons and the years, governs everything in the visible world, and is in some way the cause of all the things that he used to see. It's clear that would be his next step. What about when he reminds himself of his first dwelling place, his fellow prisoners, and what passed for wisdom there? Don't you think that he'd count himself happy for change and the pity of the others? Certainly. And if there had been any honors, praises, or prizes among them for the one who was sharpest at identifying the shadows as they passed by, and who best remembered which usually came earlier, which later, and which simultaneously, and who could thus best divine the future, do you think that our man would desire these rewards, or envy those among the prisoners who were honored and held power? Instead, wouldn't he feel, with Homer, that he'd much prefer to work the earth as a serf to another, and one without possessions, and go through any sufferings, rather than share their opinions, and live as they do? I would suppose he would rather suffer anything than live like that. Consider this, too. If this man went down into the cave again and sat down in the same seat, wouldn't his eyes, coming suddenly out of the sun like that, be filled with darkness? They certainly would. And before his eyes had recovered, and the adjustment would not be quick while his vision was still dim, and if he had to compete again with perpetual prisoners in recognizing the shadows, wouldn't he invite ridicule? Wouldn't it be said of him that he'd returned from his upward journey with his eyesight ruined, and that it isn't worthwhile even to try to travel upward? And as far as anyone who tried to free them and lead them upward, if they could somehow get their hands on him, wouldn't they kill him? They certainly would. This whole image, Glaucon, must be fitted together with what we said before. The visible realm should be likened to the prison dwelling, and the light of the fire inside it to the power of the sun. And if you interpret the upward journey and the study of things above as the upward journey of the soul to the intelligible realm, you'll grasp what I hope to convey, since that is what you wanted to hear about. Whether it's true or not, only the God knows. But this is how I see it. In the knowledgeable realm, the form of the good is the last thing to be seen, and it is reached only with difficulty. Once one has seen it, however, one must conclude that it is the cause of all that is correct and beautiful in anything, that it produces both light and its source in the visible realm, and that in the intelligible realm it controls and provides truth and understanding, so that anyone who is to act sensibly in private or public must see it. I have the same thought, at least as far as I am able. Come then, share with me this thought also. Isn't it surprising that the ones who get to the point are unwilling to occupy themselves with human affairs, and that their souls are always pressing upwards, eager to spend their time above? For, after all, this is surely what we expect, if indeed things fit the image I described before. It is. What about what happens when someone turns from divine study to the evils of human life? Don't you think it's surprising, since his sight is still dim and he hasn't become accustomed to the darkness around him, that he behaves awkwardly and appears completely ridiculous if he's compelled, either in the courts or elsewhere, to contend about the shadows of justice or the statues of which there are the shadows, and a dispute about the way these things are understood by people who have never seen justice itself? That's not surprising at all. No, it isn't. But anyone with any understanding will remember that the eyes may be confused in two ways and come from two causes. Namely, when they've come from the light into the darkness, and when they've come from the darkness into the light. Realizing that the same applies to the soul, when someone sees a soul disturbed and unable to see something, he won't laugh mindlessly, but he'll take into consideration whether it comes from a brighter life and is dim through not having yet become accustomed to the dark, or whether it has come from greater ignorance into greater light and is dazzled by the increased brilliance. Then he'll declare the first soul happy in its experience in life, and he'll pity the latter. But even if he chose to make fun of it, at least he'll be less ridiculous than if he laughed at a soul that has come from the light above. What you say is very reasonable. If that's true, then here's what we must think about these matters. Education isn't what people declare it to be, namely putting knowledge into souls that lack it, like putting sight into blind eyes. They do say that. But our present discussion, on the other hand, shows that the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and that the instrument with which each learns is like an eye that cannot be turned away from darkness to light without turning the whole body. This instrument cannot be turned around from that which is coming into being without turning the whole soul until it is able to study that which is in the brightest thing that is, namely, the one we call good. Isn't that right? Yes. Then education is the craft concerned with doing this very thing, this turning around, with how the soul can most easily and effectively be able to do it. It isn't the craft of putting sight into the soul. Education takes for granted that sight is there, but that it isn't turned the right way or looking where it ought to look, and it tries to redirect it appropriately. So it seems. Now it looks as though the other so-called virtues of the soul are akin to those of the body, for they really aren't there beforehand, but added later by habit and practice. However, the virtue of reason seems to belong above all to something more divine, which never loses its power but is either useful and beneficial, or useless and harmful, depending on the way it is turned. Or have you noticed this about people who are said to be vicious but clever, how keen the vision of their little souls is, and how sharply it distinguishes the thing it is turned towards? This shows that sight isn't inferior, but rather is forced to serve evil ends, so that the sharper it sees, the more evil it accomplishes. Absolutely. However, if a nature of this sort has been hammered at from childhood and freed from the bonds of kinship with becoming, which have been fastened to it by feasting, greed, and other such pleasures, and which, like leaden weights, pull its vision downwards, if, being rid of these, it turned to look at true things, then I say that the same soul of the same person would see these more sharply, just as it now does the things it presently turn towards. Probably so. And what about the uneducated who have no experience of truth? Isn't it likely, indeed doesn't it follow necessarily, from what was said before, that they will never adequately govern a city? But neither would those who've been allowed to spend their whole lives being educated. The former would fail because they don't have a single goal at which all their actions, public and private, inevitably aim. The latter would fail because they refused to act, thinking that they had settled while still alive in the faraway Isles of the Blessed. That's true. It is our task as founders, then, to compel the best natures to reach the study we said before is the most important, namely, to make the ascent and see the good. But when they've made it and look sufficiently, we mustn't allow them to do what they're allowed to do today. What's that? To stay there and refuse to go down to the prisoners in the cave and share their labors and honors, whether they are of less worth or of greater. Then, are we to do them an injustice by making them live a worse life when they could live a better one? You are forgetting again that it isn't the law's concern to make any one class in the city outstandingly happy, but to contrive to spread happiness throughout the city by bringing the citizens into harmony with each other, through persuasion or compulsion, and by making them share with each other the benefits that each class can confer on the community. The law produces such people in the city, not in order to allow them to turn in whatever direction they want, but to make use of them to bind the city together. That's true, I had forgotten. Observe, then, Glaucon, that we won't be doing an injustice to those who become philosophers in our city, and that we'll say to them, when we compel them to guard and care for the others, we will be just. We'll say, when people like you come to be in other cities, they're justified in not sharing in their city labors, for they've grown there spontaneously against the will of the Constitution. And what grows of its own accord and owes no debt for its upbringing has justice on its side when it isn't keen to pay anyone for that upbringing. But we've made you kings in our city and leaders of the swarm, as it were, both for yourselves and for the rest of the city. You're better and more completely educated than the others, and are better able to share in both types of life. Therefore, each of you must in turn go down to live in the common dwelling place of the others, and grow accustomed to seeing in the dark. When you are used to it, you'll see vastly better than the people there. And because you've seen the truth about fine, just and good things, you'll know what each image for what it is, and also that of which it is the image. Thus, for you and for us, the city will be governed, not like the majority of cities nowadays, not by people who fight over shadows and struggle against one another in order to rule, as if that were a great good, but by people who are awake rather than dreaming. For the truth is surely this: a city whose prospective rulers are least eager to rule must of necessity be most free from civil war, whereas a city with the opposite kind of rulers is governed in the opposite way. Absolutely. Then do you think that those we've nurtured will disobey us and refuse to share the labors of the city, each in turn, while living the greater part of their time with one another in the pure realm? It isn't possible, for we be giving just orders to just people. Each of them will certainly go to rule as to something compulsory, however, which is exactly the opposite of what's done by those who now rule in each city. This is how it is. If you can find a way of life that's better than ruling for the prospective rulers, your well-governed city will become a possibility. For only in it will the truly rich rule, not those who are rich in gold, but those who are rich in the wealth that the happy must have, namely, a good and rational life. But if beggars hungry for private goods go into public life, thinking that the good is there for the seizing, then the well-governed city is impossible, for then the ruling is something fought over, and this civil and domestic war destroys these people and the rest of the city as well. That's very true. Can you name any life that despises political rule besides that of the true philosopher? No, by God, I can't. But surely it is those who are not lovers of ruling who must rule, for if they don't, the lovers of it, or rivals, will fight over it, of course. Then who will you compel to become guardians of the city, if not those who have the best understanding of what matters for good government, and who have other honors than political ones and a better life as well? No one. Do you want us to consider now how such people will come to be in our city, and how, just as some are said to have gone up from Hades to the gods, will lead them up to the light? Of course I do. This isn't, it seems, a matter of spinning a potsherd, but of turning a soul from a day that is a kind of night to the true day, the ascent to which is, to what is, which we say is true philosophy. Indeed. Then mustn't we try to discover the subjects that have the power to bring this about? Of course. So what subject is it, Glaucon, that draws from the soul from the realm of becoming to the realm of what is? And it occurs to me as I'm speaking that we said, didn't we, that it is necessary for the prospective rulers to be athletes in war when they're young? Yes, we did. Then the subject we're looking for must also have this characteristic in addition to the former one. Which one? It mustn't be useless to warlike men. If it's at all possible, it mustn't. Now, prior to this, we educated them in music and poetry and physical training. We did. And physical training is concerned with what comes into being and dies, for it oversees the growth and decay of the body, apparently. So it couldn't be the subject we're looking for. No, it couldn't. Then, could it be the music and poetry we described before? But that, if you remember, is just the counterpart of physical training. It educated the guardians through habits, its harmonies gave them a certain harmoniousness, not knowledge, its rhythms gave them a certain rhythmical quality, and its stories, whether fictional or nearer the truth, cultivated other habits akin to these. But as for the subject we're looking for now, there's nothing like that in music and poetry. Your reminder is exactly to the point. There's really nothing like that in music and poetry. But Glocken, what is there that does have this? The crafts all seem to be base or mechanical. How could they be otherwise? But apart from music and poetry, physical training, and the crafts, what subject is left? Well, if we can't find anything apart from these, let's consider one of the subjects that touches all of them. What sort of thing? For example, the common thing that every craft, every type of thought, and every science uses that is among the first compulsory subjects for anyone. What's that? The inconsequential matter of distinguishing the one, the two, and the three. In short, I mean number and calculation. For isn't it true that every craft and science must have a share in that? They certainly must. Then so must warfare. Absolutely. In the tragedies, at any rate, Palamedes is always showing up Agamemnon as a totally ridiculous general. Haven't you noticed? He says that by inventing numbers, he established how many troops were in the Trojan army and counted their ships and everything else, implying that they were uncounted before, and that Agamemnon, if he indeed didn't know how to count, didn't even know how many feet he had. What kind of general do you think that made him? A very strange one. That's true. Then won't we set down the subject as compulsory for a warrior, so that he is able to count and calculate? More compulsory than anything. If, that is, he's to understand anything about setting his troops in order, or even if he's even to be properly human. Then do you notice the same thing about the subject that I do? What's that? That this turns out to be one of the subjects we were looking for that naturally leads to understanding. But no one uses it correctly, namely, as something that is really fitted in every way to draw one towards being. What do you mean? I'll try to make my view clear as follows. I'll distinguish for myself the things that do or don't lead in the direction we mention, and you must study them along with me and either agree or disagree, and that way we may come to know more clearly whether these things are indeed as I define. Point them out. I'll point out then, if you can grasp it, that some perceptions don't summon the understanding to look into them, because the judgment of sense perception is itself adequate, while others encourage it in every way to look into them, because sense perception seems to produce no sound result. You're obviously referring to things appearing in the distance and to Trompe-l'oeil paintings. You're not quite getting my meaning. Then what do you mean? The ones that don't summon the understanding are all those that don't go off into opposite perceptions at the same time. But the ones that do go off in that way that I call summoners, whenever sense perception doesn't declare one thing any more than its opposite, no matter whether the object striking the senses is near at hand or far away. You'll understand my meaning better if I put it this way. These, we say, are three fingers. The smallest, the second, and the middle finger. That's right. Assume that I'm talking about them as being seen from close by. Now, this is my question about them. What? It's apparent that each of them is equally a finger, and it makes no difference in this regard whether the finger is seen to be in the middle or at either end, whether it is dark or pale, thick or thin, or anything else of that sort. For in all these cases, an ordinary soul isn't compelled to ask the understanding what a finger is, since sight doesn't suggest to it that a finger is at the same time the opposite of a finger. It doesn't. Therefore, it isn't likely that anything of that sort would summon or awaken the understanding. No, it isn't. But what about the bigness and smallness of fingers? Does sight perceive them adequately? Does it make no difference to it whether the finger is in the middle or at the end? And is it the same without the sense of touch, as regards the thick and the thin, the hard and the soft? And do the other senses reveal things clearly and adequately? Doesn't each of them rather do the following? The sense set over the hard is, in the first place, of necessity, and also set over the soft, and it reports to the soul that the same thing is perceived by it to be both hard and soft. That's right. And isn't it necessary that in such cases the soul is puzzled as to what the sense means by the hard? if it indicates the same thing is also soft, or what it means by the light and the heavy, if it indicates that the heavy is light or the light heavy. Yes, indeed. These are strange reports for the soul to receive, and they do demand to be looked into. Then it's likely that in such cases the soul, summoning calculation and understanding, first tries to determine whether each of the things announced to it is one or two. Of course. If it's evidently two, won't each be evidently distinct in one? Yes. Then, if each is one and both two, the soul will understand that the two are separate, for it wouldn't understand the inseparable to be two, but rather one. That's right. Sight, however, saw the big and small not as separate, but as mixed up together. Isn't that so? Yes. And in order to get clear about all this, understanding was compelled to see the big and the small not as mixed up together, but as separate, the opposite way from sight. True. And isn't it from these cases that it first occurs to ask what the big is and what the small is? Absolutely. And because of this, we call the one the intelligible and the other the visible? That's right. This, then, is what I was trying to express before when I said that some things summon thought while others don't. Those that strike the relevant sense at the same time as their opposites I call summoners. Those that don't do this do not awaken understanding. Now I understand, and I think you're right. Well, then to which of them do number and the one belong? I don't know. Reason it out from what was said before. If the one is adequately seen itself by itself, or so perceived by any of the other senses, then, as we were saying in the case of fingers, it wouldn't draw the soul towards being. But if something opposite to it is always seen at the same time, so that nothing is apparently any more than the opposite of one, then something would be needed to judge the matter. The soul would then be puzzled, would look for an answer, and would stir up its understandings, and would ask what the one itself is. And so this would be among the subjects that lead the soul and turn it around towards the study of that which is. But surely the sight of the one does possess this characteristic to a remarkable degree. For we are the same thing to be one in an unlimited number at the same time. Then if this is true of the one, won't it also be true of all the numbers? Of course. Now calculation and arithmetic are wholly concerned with numbers. That's right. Then evidently they lead us towards truth, supernaturally so. Then they belong, it seems, to the subjects we're seeking. They are compulsory for warriors because of their orderly ranks, and for philosophers because they have to learn to rise up out of becoming and grasp being if they are ever to become rational. That's right. And our guardian must be both a warrior and a philosopher. Certainly. Then it would be appropriate, Glaucon, to legislate the subject for those who are going to share in the highest offices in the city, and to persuade them to calculation to take it up, not as laymen do, but staying with it until they reach the study of the natures of the numbers by means of understanding itself, nor like tradesmen and retailers, for the sake of buying and selling, but for the sake of war and for ease in turning the soul around, away from becoming and towards truth and being. Well put. Moreover, it strikes me, now that it has been mentioned how sophisticated the subject of the calculation is, and in how many ways it is useful for our purposes, provided that one practices it for the sake of knowing rather than trading. How is it useful? In the very way we were talking about. It leads the soul forcibly upward and compels it to discuss the numbers themselves, never permitting anyone to propose for discussion numbers attached to visible or tangible bodies. You know what those who are very clever in these matters are like. If, in the course of the argument, someone tries to divide the one itself, they laugh and won't permit it. If you divide it, then multiply it, and taking care that one thing never be found to be many parts rather than one. That's very true. Then what do you think would happen, Glaucon, if someone were to ask them, what kind of numbers are you still talking about, in which the one is, as you assume it to be, each one equal to every other, with at the least difference in containing no internal parts? I think they'd answer they are talking about those numbers that can be grasped only in thought and can't be dealt with in any other way. Then do you see that it's likely that the subject really is compulsory for us, because it compels the soul to use understanding itself on the truth itself? Indeed, it most certainly does that. And what about those who are naturally good at calculation or reasoning? Have you already noticed that they're naturally sharp, so to speak, in all subjects, and that those are slow at it, if they're educated and exercised in it, even if they're benefited in no other way, nonetheless improve and become generally sharper than they were? That's true. Moreover, I don't think you'll easily find subjects that are harder to learn or practice than this. No, indeed. Then for all these reasons, this subject isn't to be neglected, and the best natures must be educated in it. I agree. Let that, then, be one of our subjects. Second, let's consider whether the subject comes next is appropriate for our purposes. What subject is that? Do you mean geometry? That's the very one I had in mind. Insofar as it pertains to war, it's obviously appropriate. For when it comes to setting up camp, occupying a region, concentrating troops, deploying them, or with regard to any of the other formations an army adopts in battle or on the march, it makes all the difference whether someone is a geometer or not. But for things like that, even a little geometry, or calculation for that matter, would suffice. What we need to consider is whether the greater and more advanced part of it tends to make it easier to see the form of the good. And we say that anything has that tendency if it compels the soul to turn itself towards the region in which lies the happiest of the things that are, the one the soul must see at any cost. Right. Therefore, if geometry compels the soul to study being, it's appropriate, but if it compels it to study becoming, it's appropriate. So we've said, at any rate. Now, no one with even a little experience of geometry will dispute that this science is entirely opposite of what is said about it in the accounts of its practitioners. What do you mean? They give ridiculous accounts of it, though they can't help it, for they speak like practical men, and all their accounts refer to doing things. They talk of squaring, applying, adding, and the like, whereas the entire subject is pursued for the sake of knowledge. Absolutely. And mustn't we also agree on a further point? What is that? That their accounts are for the sake of knowing what always is, not what comes into being and passes away. That's easy to agree to, for geometry is knowledge of what always is. Then it draws the soul towards truth and produces philosophic thought by directing upwards what we now wrongly direct downwards, as far as anything possibly can. Then as far as we possibly can, we must require those in your fine city not to neglect geometry in any way, for even its byproducts are not insignificant. What are they? The ones concerned with war that you mentioned. But we also surely know that, when it comes to better understanding any subject, there is a world of difference between someone who has grasped geometry and someone who hasn't. Yes, by God, a world of difference. Then shall we set this down as a second subject for the young? Let's do so, he said. And what about the astronomy? Shall we make it to the third, or do you disagree? That's fine with me, for a better awareness of the seasons, months, and years is no less appropriate for a general than for a farmer or navigator. You amuse me. You're like someone who's afraid that the majority will think that he's prescribing useless subjects. It's no easy task. Indeed, it's very difficult to realize that in every soul there is an instrument that is purified and rekindled by such subjects, but it has been blinded and destroyed by other ways of life. An instrument that is more important to preserve than 10,000 eyes, since only with it can the truth be seen. Those who share your belief that this is so will think you're speaking incredibly well, while those who've never been aware of it will probably think you're talking nonsense, since they see no benefit worth mentioning in these subjects. So decide right now which group you're addressing, or are your arguments for neither of them, but mostly for your own sake, though you won't begrudge anyone else whatever benefit he's able to get from them. The latter. I want to speak, question, and answer, mostly for my own sake. Then let's fall back to our earlier position, for we were wrong just now about the subject that comes after geometry. What was our error? After plane surfaces, we went on to revolving solids before dealing with solids by themselves. But the right thing to do is to take up the third dimension right after the second, and this, I suppose, consists of cubes and of whatever shares in depth. You're right, Socrates, but this subject hasn't been developed yet. There are two reasons for that. First, because no city values it, this difficult subject is little researched. Second, the researchers need a director, for without one they won't discover anything. To begin with, such a director is hard to find, and then, even if he could be found, those who currently do research in this field won't be too arrogant to follow him. If an entire city helped him to supervise it, however, and took the lead in valuing it, then he would be followed. And if the subject was consistently and vigorously pursued, it would soon be developed. Even now, when it isn't valued and is held in contempt by the majority and is pursued by researchers who are unable to give an account of its usefulness, nevertheless, in spite of all these handicaps, the force of its charm has caused it to develop somewhat, so it wouldn't be surprising if it were further developed even as things stand. The subject has outstanding charm, but explain more clearly what you were saying just now. The subject that deals with plane surfaces you took to be geometry. Yes. And at first you put astronomy after it, but later you went back on that. In my haste to go through them at all, I've only progressed more slowly. The subject dealing with the dimension of depth was next, but because it is in a ridiculous state, I passed it by and spoke of astronomy, which deals with the motion of things having depth, after geometry. That's right. Let's then put astronomy as the fourth subject on the assumption that solid geometry will be available if the city takes it up. That seems reasonable, and since you reproached me before for praising astronomy in a vulgar manner, I'll now praise it your way, for I think it's clear to everyone that astronomy compels the soul to look upward and leads it from things here to things there. It may be obvious to everyone except me, but that's not my view about it. Then what is your view? As is practiced today by those who teach philosophy, it makes the soul look very much downward. How do you mean? In my opinion, your conception of higher studies is a good deal too generous, or if someone were to study something by leaning his head back and studying ornaments on the ceiling, it looks as though you'd say he's studying not with his eyes but with his understanding. Perhaps you're right and I'm foolish, but I can't conceive of any subject making the soul look upward, except one concerned with that which is, and that which is invisible. If anyone attempts to learn something about sensible things, whether by gaping upward or squinting downward, I'd claim, since there's no knowledge of such things, that he never learns anything, and that, even if he studies lying on his back on the ground or floating on in the sea, his soul is looking not up but down. You're right to reproach me, and I've been justly punished, but what did you mean when you said that astronomy must be learned in a different way from the way in which it is learned at present if it is to be a useful subject for our purposes? It's like this. We should consider the decorations in the sky to be the most beautiful and most exact of visible things, seeing that they're embroidered on a visible surface, but we should consider their motions to fall short of the true ones, motions that are really fast or slow as measured in true numbers, that trace out true geometrical figures, that are all in relation to one another, and that they are the true motions of the things carried along in them. And these, of course, must be grasped by reason and thought, not by sight. Or do you think otherwise? Not at all. Therefore, we should use the embroidery in the sky as a model in the study of these other things. If someone experienced in geometry were to come upon plans very carefully drawn and worked out by Daedalus or some other craftsman or artist, he'd consider them to be very finely executed, but he'd think it ridiculous to examine them seriously in order to find the truth in them by the equal, the double, or any other ratio. How could it be anything other than ridiculous? Then don't you think that a real astronomer will feel the same when he looks at the motions of the stars? He'll believe that the craftsmen of the heavens arranged them and that all that's in them in the finest way possible for such things. But as for the ratio of night to day, of days to of a month or to a year, or of the motions of the stars to any of them or to each other, don't you think you'll consider it strange to believe that they're always the same and never deviate anywhere at all, or try in any sort of way to grasp the truth about them, since they're connected to body invisible? That's my opinion anyway, now that I hear it from you. Then if, by really taking part in astronomy, we're to make the naturally intelligent part of the soul useful instead of useless, let's study astronomy by means of problems, as we do geometry, and leave the things in the sky alone. The task you're prescribing is a lot harder than anything now attempted in astronomy. And I suppose that, if we are to benefit are we to be of any benefit as lawgivers, our prescriptions for the other subjects will be of the same kind. But have you any other appropriate subject to suggest? Not offhand. Well, there isn't just one form of motion, but several. Perhaps a wise person could list them all, but there are two that are evident even to us. What are they? Besides the ones we've discussed, there is also its counterpart. What's that? It's likely that, as the eye fastened on astronomical motions, so the ears fasten on harmonic ones, and that the sciences of astronomy and harmonics are closely akin. This is what the Pythagoreans say, Lachlan, and we agree, don't we? We do. Therefore, since the subject is so huge, shouldn't we ask them what they have to say about harmonic motions, and whether there is anything else besides them, all the while keeping our own goal squarely in view? What's that? That those whom we are rearing should never try to learn anything incomplete, anything that doesn't reach the end that everything should reach, the end that we mentioned just now in the case of astronomy. Or don't you know that people do something similar in harmonics? Measuring audible consonants and sounds against one another, they labor in vain, just like present-day astronomers. Yes, by the gods, and pretty ridiculous they are too. They talk about something they call a dense interval, or quarter tone, putting their ears to their instruments like someone trying to overhear what their neighbors are saying. And some say that they hear a tone in between, and that it is the shortest interval by which they must measure, while others argue that this tone sounds the same as a quarter tone. Both put ears before understanding. You mean those excellent fellows who torment their strings, torturing them and stretching them on pegs? I won't draw out the analogy by speaking of blows with the plectrum or the accusation of denials and boastings on the part of the strings. Instead, I'll cut it short by saying that these are the people I'm talking about. The ones I mean are the ones we just said we are going to question about harmonics, but they do the same as the astronomers. They seek out the numbers that are to be found in these audible consonances, but they do not make the ascent to problems. They don't investigate, for example, which numbers are consonant and which aren't, or what the explanation is of each. But that would be a superhuman task. Yet it's useful in the search for the beautiful and the good. Pursued for any other purpose, it's useless. Probably so. Moreover, I take it that if inquiry into all the subjects we've mentioned brings out their association and relationship with one another and draws conclusions about their kinship, it does contribute something to our goal and isn't labor in vain, but that otherwise it is in vain. I too divine that this is true, but you're talking about a very big task, Socrates. Do you mean the prelude or what? Or don't you know that all these subjects are merely preludes to the song itself that must also be learned? Surely you don't think that the people who are clever in these matters are dialecticians? No, by God, I don't, although I have met a few exceptions. But it ever seemed to you that those who can neither give nor follow an account know anything at all of the things we say they must know? My answer to that is also no. Then isn't this at last, Glaucon, the song that dialectic sings? It is intelligible, but it is imitated by the power of sight. We said that sight tries at last to look at the animals themselves, the stars themselves, and in the end at the sun itself. In the same way, whenever someone tries through argument and apart from all sense perceptions to find the being itself of each thing and doesn't give up until he grasps the good itself with the understanding itself, he reaches the end of the intelligible, just as the other reached the end of the visible. Absolutely. And what about this journey? Don't you call it dialectic? I do. Then the release from bonds and the turning around from shadows to statues in the light of the fire, and then the way up and out of the cave to the sunlight, and there the continuing inability to look at the animals, the plants, and the light of the sun, but the newly acquired ability to look at divine images of water and shadows of things that are, rather than, as before, merely at shadows of statues thrown by another source of light that is itself a shadow in relation to the sun. All this business of the crafts we've mentioned has the power to awaken the best part of the soul and lead it upward to the study of the best among the things that are, just as before, the clearest thing in the body was led to the brightest thing in the bodily and physical realm. I accept that this is so, even though it seems very hard to accept in one way and hard not to accept in another. All the same, we'll have to return to these things often in the future, rather than having to hear them just once now. Let's assume that what you've said is so, and turn to the song itself, discussing it in the same way as we did the prelude. So tell us, what is the sort of power? What is that sort of power dialectic has? What forms is it divided into, and what path does it follow? For these lead at last, it seems, toward the place which is a rest from the road, so to speak, and an end of journeying for the one who reaches it. You won't be able to follow me any longer, Glaucon, even though there is no lack of eagerness on my part to lead you, for you would no longer be seeing an image of what we're describing, but the truth itself. At any rate, that's how it seems to me. That it is really so is not worth insisting on any further, but that there is something to be seen, that is something we must insist on. Isn't that so? Of course. And we mustn't also insist that the power of dialectic could reveal it only to someone experienced in the subjects we've described, and that it cannot reveal it in any other way? That too is worth insisting on. At any rate, no one will dispute it when we say that there is no other inquiry that systematically attempts to grasp with respect to each thing itself what the being of it is. For all the other crafts are concerned with human opinions and desires, with growing or construction, or with the care of growing or constructed things. And as for the rest, I mean geometry and the subjects that followed it, we describe them as to some extent grasping what is, for we saw that, while they do dream about what is, they are unable to command a waking view of it as long as they make use of hypotheses that they leave untouched and they cannot give any account of. What mechanism could possibly turn any agreement into knowledge when it begins with something unknown and puts together the conclusion and the steps in between from what is unknown? None. Therefore, dialectic is the only inquiry that travels this road, doing away with hypotheses and proceeding to the first principle itself, so as to be secure. And when the eye of the soul is really buried in a sort of barbaric bog, dialectic gently pulls it out and leads it upwards, using the crafts we described to help it and cooperate with it in turning the soul around. From force of habit, they've often called these crafts sciences or kinds of knowledge, but they need another name, clearer than opinion, darker than knowledge. We called them thought somewhere before, but I presume that we won't dispute about a name when we have so many important matters to investigate. Of course not. It will therefore be enough to call the first section knowledge, the second thought, the third belief, and the fourth imaging, just as we did before. The last two together we call opinion, the other two intellect. Opinion is concerned with becoming, intellect with being. And as being is to becoming, so intellect is to opinion, and as intellect is to opinion, so knowledge is to belief and thought to imaging. But as for the ratios between things, these are set over in the division of either the opinable or the intelligible section into two. Let's pass them by, Glaucon, lest they involve us in arguments many times longer than the ones we've already gone through. I agree with you about the others in any case, insofar as I'm able to follow. Then do you call someone who is able to give an account of the being of each thing dialectical? But insofar as he is unable to give an account of something, either to himself or to another, do you deny that he has any understanding of it? How could I do anything else? Then the same applies to the good. Unless someone can distinguish in an account of the form of good from everything else, can survive all refutation, as if in a battle, striving to judge things not in accordance with opinion, but in accordance with being, and come through all this with his account still intact, you'll say that he doesn't know the good itself or any other good. But if he somehow gets hold of some image of it, he'll say that it's through opinion, not knowledge, for he is dreaming in his sleep through his present life. Before he wakes up here, he will arrive in Hades and go to sleep forever. Yes, by God, I'll certainly say all of that. Then, as for those children of yours whom you're rearing and educating in theory, if you ever reared them in fact, I don't think that you'd allow them to rule in your city or be responsible for the most important things while they are as irrational as incommensurable lines. Certainly not. Then you'll legislate that they are to give most attention to the education that will enable them to ask and answer questions most knowledgeably? I'll legislate it along with you. Then do you think that we've placed dialectic at the top of the other subjects, like a coping stone, and that no other subject can be rightly placed above it, but that our account of the subjects that a future ruler must learn has come to an end? Probably so. Then it remains for you to deal with the distribution of these subjects, with the question of to whom we'll assign them and in what way. That's clearly next. Do you remember what sort of people we chose in our earlier selection of rulers? Of course I do. In the other respects, the same natures have to be chosen. We have to select the most stable, the most courageous, and as far as possible, the most graceful. In addition, we must not look only for people who have a noble and tough character, but for those who have the natural qualities conducive to this education of ours. Which ones exactly? They must be keen on the subjects and learn them easily, for people's souls give up much more easily in hard study than in physical training, since the pain, being peculiar to them and not shared with their body, is more their own. That's true. We must also look for someone who has got a good memory, is persistent, and is every way a lover of hard work. How else do you think he'd be willing to carry out both the requisite bodily labors and also complete so much study and practice? Nobody would unless his nature was in every way a good one. In any case, the present error, which as we said before explains why philosophy isn't valued, is that she's taken up by people who are unworthy of her. For illegitimate students shouldn't be allowed to take her up, but only legitimate ones. How so? In the first place, no student should be lame in his love of hard work, really loving one half of it and hating the other half. This happens when someone is a lover of physical training, hunting, or any kind of bodily labor, and isn't a lover of learning, listening, or inquiry, but hates the work involved in them. And someone whose love of hard work tends in the opposite direction is also lame. That's very true. Similarly, with regard to truth, we won't say that a soul is maimed if it hates a voluntary falsehood, cannot endure to have one in itself, and is greatly angered when it exists in others, but is nonetheless content to accept an involuntary falsehood, isn't angry when it is caught being ignorant, and bears its lack of learning easily, wallowing in it like a pig. Absolutely. And with regard to moderation, courage, high-mindedness, and all the other parts of virtue, it is also important to distinguish the illegitimate from the legitimate. For when either a city or an individual doesn't know how to do this, it unwittingly employs the lame and illegitimate as friends or rulers for whatever services it wants done. That's just how it is. So we must be careful in all these matters, for if we bring people who are of sound of limb and mind to so great a subject and training, and educate them in it, even justice itself won't blame us and will save the city and its constitution. But if we bring people of a different sort, we'll do the opposite and let loose an even greater flood of ridicule upon philosophy. And it would be shameful to do that. It certainly would. But I seem to have done something a bit ridiculous myself just now. What's that? I forgot that we were only playing, and so I spoke too vehemently. But I looked upon philosophy as I spoke, and seeing her undeservedly besmirched, I seem to have lost my temper and have said I had to say too earnestly, as if I were angry with those responsible for it. That certainly wasn't my impression as I listened to you, but it was mine as I was speaking. In any case, let's not forget that in our early selection we chose older people but that isn't permitted in this one, for we mustn't believe Solon when he says that as someone grows older he'll be able to learn a lot. He can do that even less well than he can run races, for all great and numerous labors belong to the young, necessarily. Therefore, calculation, geometry, and all the preliminary education required for dialectic must be offered to the future rulers in childhood, and not in the shape of compulsory learning either. Why is that? Because no free person should learn anything like a slave. Forced bodily labor does no harm to the body, but nothing taught by force stays in the soul. That's true. Then don't use force to train the children in these subjects. Use play instead. That way you'll also see better what each of them is naturally fitted for. That seems reasonable. Do you remember we stated that the children were to be led into war on horseback as observers, and that whenever it is safe to do so, they should be brought close and taste blood, like puppies? I remember. In all these things, in labors, studies, and fears, the one who always shows the greatest aptitude are to be described on a list. At what age? When they're released from compulsory physical training, for during that period, whether it's 2 or 3 years, young people are incapable of doing anything else, since weariness and sleep are enemies of learning. At the same time, how they fare in this physical training is itself an important test. Of course it is. And after that, that is to say, from the age of 20, those who are chosen will also receive more honors than the others. Moreover, the subjects they learn in no particular order as children, they must now bring together to form a unified vision of their kinship, both with one another and with the nature of that which is. At any rate, only learning of that sort holds firm in those who receive it. It is also the greatest test of who is naturally dialectical and who isn't. For anyone who can achieve a unified vision is dialectical, and anyone who can't isn't. I agree. Well, then you'll have to look out for the ones who most of all have this ability in them and who also remain steadfast in their studies, in war, and in the other activities laid down by law. And after they have reached their 30th year, you'll select them in turn from among those chosen earlier and assign them yet greater honors. Then you'll have to test them by means of this power of dialectic to discover which of them can relinquish his eyes and other senses, going on with the help of truth to that which by itself is. And this is a task that requires great care. What's the main reason for that? Don't you realize what a great evil comes from dialectic as it is currently practiced? What evil is that? Those who practice it are filled with lawlessness. They certainly are. Don't you think that it's surprising that this happens to them? Aren't you sympathetic? Why isn't it surprising? Why would I be sympathetic? Because it's like the case of a child brought up surrounded by much wealth and many flatterers in a great numerous family. One who finds out when he has become a man that he isn't the child of his professed parents and that he can't discover his real ones. Can you divine what the attitude of someone like that would be to the flatterers on the one hand and to his supposed parents on the other, before he knew about his parentage and what it would be when he found out? Or would you rather hear what I divine about it? I'd rather hear your views. Well, then I divine that during the time that he didn't know the truth, he'd honor his mother, father, and the rest of his supposed family more than he would the flatterers, that he'd pay greater attention to their needs, to be less likely to treat them lawlessly in word or deed, and be more likely to obey them than the flatterers in any matters of importance. Probably so. And when he became aware of the truth, however, his honor and enthusiasm would lessen for this family and increase for the flatterers. He'd obey the letter far more than before and begin to live in the way that they did, keep company with them openly, and unless he was very decent by nature, he'd eventually care nothing for that father of his or any of the rest of his supposed family. All this would probably happen as you say, but in what way is it an image of those who take up arguments? As follows. We hold from childhood certain convictions about just and fine things. We brought them up with them as with our parents, we obey and honor them. Indeed we do. There are other ways of living, however, opposite to these and full of pleasures, that flatter the soul and attract it to themselves, but which don't persuade sensible people, who continue to honor and obey the convictions of their fathers. That's right. And then a questioner comes along and asks someone of this sort, what is the fine? And when he answers that about what he has heard from the traditional lawgiver, the argument refutes him, and by refuting him often and in many places shakes him from his convictions, and makes him believe that the fine is no more fine than shameful, and the same with the just, the good, and the things he honored most. What do you think his attitude will be then to honoring obeying his earlier convictions? Of necessity, he won't honor or obey them in the same way. Then, when he no longer honors and obeys those convictions and can't discover the true ones, will he be likely to adopt any other way of life than that which flatters him? No, he won't. And so, I suppose, from being law-abiding he becomes lawless, inevitably. Then, as I asked before, isn't it only to be expected that this is what happens to those who take up arguments in this way? And don't they therefore deserve a lot of sympathy? Yes, and they deserve pity too. Then, if you don't want your 30-year-olds to be objects of such pity, you'll have to be extremely careful about how you introduce them to arguments. That's right. And isn't it one lasting precaution not to let them taste arguments while they're young? I don't suppose that it escaped your notice that, when young people get their first taste of arguments, they must misuse it by treating it as a kind of game and contradiction? They imitate those who've refuted them by refuting others themselves, and like puppies, they enjoy dragging and tearing those around them with their arguments. They're excessively fond of it. Then, when they've refuted many and been refuted by them in turn, they forcefully and quickly fall into disbelieving what they believed before. And, as a result, they themselves and the whole of philosophy are discredited in the eyes of others. That's very true. But an older person who won't want to take part in such madness, he'll imitate someone who is willing to engage in discussion in order to look for the truth, rather than someone who plays a contradiction for sport. He'll be more sensible himself, and he will bring honor rather than discredit to the philosophical way of life. That's right. And when we said before that those allowed to take part in arguments should be orderly and steady by nature, not as nowadays, when even the unfit are allowed to engage in them, wasn't all that also said as a precaution? Of course. Then if someone continuously, strenuously, and exclusively devotes himself to participation in arguments, exercising himself in them just as he did in the bodily physical training, which is their counterpart, would that be enough? Do you mean 6 years or 4? It doesn't matter. Make it 5. And after that, you must make them go down into the cave again, and compel them to take command in matters of war, and occupy the other offices suitable for young people, so that they won't be inferior to the others in experience. But in these, too, they must be tested to see whether they'll remain steadfast when they're pulled this way and that, or shift their ground. How much time do you allow for that? 15 years. Then, at the age of 50, those who've survived the test and been successful both in practical matters and in the sciences must be led to the goal and compelled to lift up the radiant light of their souls to what itself provides light for everything. And once they've seen the good itself, they must each in turn put the city, its citizens, and themselves in order, using it as their model. Each of them will spend most of his time with philosophy, but when his turn comes, he must labor in politics and rule for the city's sake, not as if he were doing something fine, but rather something that has to be done. Then, having educated others like himself to take his place as guardians of the city, he will depart for the Isles of the Blessed and dwell there. And if Pythia agrees, the city will publicly establish memorials and sacrifices to him as a daemon, but if not, then as a happy and divine human being. Like a sculptor, Socrates, you've produced ruling men that are completely fine. And ruling women too, Locke, for you mustn't think that what I've said applies any more to men than it does to women who are born with the appropriate natures. That's right, if indeed they are to share everything equally with the men, as we said they should. Then, do you agree that the things we said about the city and its constitution aren't altogether wishful thinking? That it's hard for them to come about but not impossible? And do you also agree that they can come about only in the way we indicated, namely, when one or more true philosophers come to power in the city, who despise present honors, thinking themselves slavish and worthless, and who prize what is right and the honors that come from it above everything else, and regard justice as the most important, most essential thing, serving it and increasing it as they set their city in order? How will they do that? They'll send everyone in the city who's over 10 years old into the country. Then they'll take the possession of the children, who are now free from the ethos of their parents, and bring them up in their own customs and laws, which are the ones we've described. This is the quickest and easiest way for the city and constitution we've discussed to be established, become happy, and bring most benefit to the people among whom it's established. That's by far the quickest and easiest way. And in my opinion, Socrates, you describe well how it would come into being if it ever did. Then, isn't that enough about the city and the man who is like it? Surely it is clear what sort of man will say he has to be. It is clear, he said, and as for your question, I think we have reached the end of this topic.